Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 UEA Public Lectures in Philosophy. My name is Rupert Reed. I'm the convener of the series and one of the lecturers here in the Department of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia. You're recommended to watch this evening's proceedings in speaker view. We recommend you to switch to that in your settings, but of course, it's up to you. What's going to happen here this evening is that firstly, I'm going to make some general remarks about the series as a whole, because this is the first one of our lectures this season, of course. Then I will introduce this evening's speaker, and we're going to have a slightly different format from usual. I'm going to be in conversation with Amitav Ghosh for a fair while, and then we will open it up to the floor for a Q&A and general discussion. It's really a great pleasure to have you here with us this evening in this unique way by online magic of technology. Amitav is with us from New York, which is splendid. The reason we're doing the public lectures this way this year, of course, is because of one of the global crises that we're in the midst of. The most urgent one, the one that is consuming most of the headlines at the moment, namely, as you all know, the coronavirus crisis. So it's super that you can be with us this way. Hopefully by this time next year, we'll be back to meeting in person again. And we may even try to have an in-person event, probably an outdoor event, much later in the spring. Keep your eyes peeled for that, depending on how the pandemic proceeds. So the very fact that we are meeting in this way immediately brings to mind, makes us conscious of the fact that we are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis of a global pandemic that is historic. And that obviously is going to be one of the crises that we address in this series of lectures. The other main ones with which we'll be concerned are the climate emergency and the broader ecological emergency. And those will be our main topic here this evening. We do live in a time of extremely grave global crises. So why did we decide to have a series of public lectures that would look at the potential upside of those crises? Why title this series Bad News is Good News, even if there's a question mark at the end? Well, I want to mention a couple of reasons by way of introduction to the concept of this series of public lectures. The first reason can be put in very plain language in this way. We can't just go around with long faces. Yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic which is killing unprecedented numbers of people, at least for modern times. And we're in the middle of a slower burning, but ultimately much more serious climate and ecological emergency, which is already killing many and exterminating many of our non-human kin, and will kill many, many more until we perhaps manage to bring it under some kind of control. But that isn't a reason for simply being miserable all the time. There's much to learn, perhaps, from the emotions that we may be experiencing in relation to these crises. But those emotions, one would hope, will not be confined to grief and fear and horror, but will also include the capacity of human beings to go on experiencing well-being and happiness and more. And certainly many philosophers in the history of philosophy would recommend something like this approach. Philosophers from Epicurus, all of the Stoics in the ancient world who were the subject of the public lectures last year, to Tibetan Buddhist philosophers, would recommend that we maintain and develop our capacity for joy in the very midst of crisis. And the second reason can be summed up in the phrase which Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's chief of staff, made famous: never let a serious crisis go to waste. The coronavirus crisis and the much deeper climate and ecological emergency from which the coronavirus crisis springs, these crises need to be not just viewed as emergencies to be dealt with, but as opportunities for transformation. And we will be thinking about that across the course of these lectures. In fact, increasingly, I think, as these public lectures go on into March, that will be our topic. It would be the worst possible way of memorializing those who are dying in the midst of these crises if we were not to change our systems to make future such crises less bad or less inevitable. So those are the two reasons I would bring in to justify potentially the way we framed this series of public lectures. But ultimately, you will have to decide whether or not this framing can be justified and how to think about the topics that we're going to be discussing. We are going to be focusing primarily in these lectures upon the COVID crisis and the climate and ecological crisis. And we will be thinking about them using the term philosophy in a suitably broad sense, in a suitably interdisciplinary sense, not in a narrow academic sense. So we have Amitav Ghosh with us this evening, of course, a great novelist and also someone who has written remarkable prose about the climate emergency. By prose, I mean non-fiction prose. And I want to highlight particularly the next public lecture in a fortnight's time. I very much hope that many of you will come back again and indeed spread the word to be joined in a fortnight by Richard Horton. And Richard Horton is the editor of The Lancet. He has sprung to prominence due to the coronavirus pandemic, of course, in which he has been an unabashed critic of the UK government's response to that pandemic, as well as hosting much of the most important science to have emerged in the course of the pandemic. I'm expecting that his lecture will be both fascinating and revealing, and also most likely newsworthy. I hope you will join us then. I want to also just remark that we are very grateful, of course, as always, to the sponsorship of the Royal Institute for Philosophy, without whom these public lectures would be impossible. Okay, and now to start to turn to the topic of this evening's lecture, which, as I say, will in fact be a rather different format from usual. It'll be, excuse me, it'll be a conversation between myself and Amitav Ghosh, who, as I say, joins us very kindly from New York. And the main reason prompting this conversation is Amitav's book, The Great Derangement. And here is my copy of this book. As you can see, it's well thumbed and much used. This remarkable work appeared 5 years ago and sought to offer Amitav's perspective on the climate emergency, but with special reference to his own area of obvious expertise, i.e. writing, literature in particular. And what Amitav sought to do in the book, if you haven't read it, I very much hope you'll go away and read it after tonight's event. What Amitav sought to do in the book is to draw connections between literature and climate, and to argue that in this derangement that he argues that we are subject to, the great derangement basically in the first instance refers to the deranged way in which we are living and allowing ourselves to be sucked deeper and deeper into the climate emergency. That in this great derangement, literature is not an innocent party. And Amitav makes quite a strong case, in fact, that modernist literature may have even been part of the problem rather than part of the solution to thinking about and getting a perspective on this epochal condition of our times, the climate emergency. So Amitav and I are going to be talking about silver linings from the climate and ecological emergency. But to get to those, we're going to first have to talk about some of the non-silver linings. We're going to have to first talk about some of the obvious, tragic, appalling downsides of the situation, and about the way in which Amitav makes this very striking claim that literature has been, as I say, not an innocent party to the discussion, let alone really helping. Amitav begins The Great Derangement by talking about an event that happened in his own life some considerable time ago now, when he experienced a freak weather event, a tornado in Delhi. And he remarks that he's found it difficult or even impossible down the years to include that tornado in his fiction, even though it had a very strong effect upon him. So if I can start our conversation, Amitav, by addressing the following question to you. You suggested in The Great Derangement that there's a problem, there's a real difficulty in writing about the climate emergency, the climate crisis. So in a certain sense, we shouldn't be too hard on those novelists and others who have struggled to wrestle with it. And the difficulty can be summed up in a very simple way, really, that the truth is stranger than fiction. You were concerned that if you were to insert a freak event like this tornado into one of your novels, nobody would believe it. And of course, one of the things that one often hears as a criticism addressed to novelists is, well, I felt it was unrealistic. Your thought then was something like that the weather itself is being deranged by climate, by anthropogenic climate chaos, climate breakdown incipient. And this makes it very hard to write novels about climate. And you also mentioned some other reasons why it's hard to write novels which feature climate heavily. For example, the long timescale on which the climate emergency opens up. The question I'd like to ask you is this, Amitav. It's 5 years now since the Great Derangement, and something striking and terrible has occurred in those years, namely that our global weather has weirded considerably greater, starting in about 2016 to 2017. There's been a massive uptick in freak weather events, in weather emergencies, in weather disasters, which are more or less, it's more or less clear in most cases, are connected to the change in our climate that's caused by greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And scientists are getting better and better at attributing these weather events to climate. Does the fact that the global weather has weirded a lot more during that period, does that have a teeny weeny silver lining in that it makes it easier now, perhaps, to write fiction about climate, fiction that speaks to our condition? What do you think on this question, Amitav?
Well, first of all, Rupert, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be with you and with all the listeners. I wish I could have been there in person, but of course, you know, we're not in that world anymore. We're in a different world, as you say. Yeah, it's interesting. The first sort of presentation I did of the Great Derangement was actually at St. Anthony's College at Oxford. It was, I think, 2014 or something. And the reception was quite hostile. It was quite striking. I mean, and that didn't surprise me, because certainly within within my circles, within the circles of writers and so on, whenever I told people that I was thinking about climate, they would all look very surprised and say, really, why? I mean, how is it any of your business? I mean, I don't think anyone would respond in that way now. The Great Derangement came out in 2016. And since then, there has, as you say, there's been a major change. I think the real inflection point was 2018, in many different ways. I mean, 2018 was a particularly bad year, but it was the year when it became impossible to ignore, the absolute sort of freaking out of weather systems all around the planet. And since then, I think there has been a major change in consciousness. Greta Thunberg, that whole phenomenon also emerged in 2018. Extinction Rebellion came a little later. But, there was, I think, a major awakening across the planet. So 2018 was a major inflection point. It was an inflection point in another way as well. It's not that writers haven't been writing about these issues. A lot of them have. The point that I was trying to make in The Great Derangement is that the way the literary world is set up, the moment you take on a subject like this, your work gets siloed off, into a genre. And usually these are sort of marginalized genres like, science fiction or, fantasy fiction, or what they call climate fiction or apocalyptic fiction, and so on and so forth. And, so simply by writing about these issues, your work becomes something other than serious literature, And that to me is a really interesting and puzzling idea. I mean, how is it that this thing, which is the most serious thing that's happening on the planet, how does that get treated as not serious? And so, in the Great Derangement, I sort of really explore this whole idea of what is this bourgeois idea of seriousness.
Mm.
So there again, I think there was a really significant change in 2018. Richard Powers published his book Overstory in 2018. An overstory is in a very serious way about, the planetary crisis. I mean, I don't think we can really talk about climate change anymore because, as Margaret Atwood says, it's not just climate change; it's everything change. And these are all, as you said, you made a very good point in your opening remarks that all of these are interconnected. All these crises are actually accelerating each other. But what was really striking about the reception of Richard Powers' book was that it wasn't treated as non-serious. It wasn't treated as though it were a genre writing. It wasn't treated as fantasy. It wasn't treated as something other than what it is, which is a very serious and important book. So it was on the short list for the Booker Prize and so on. I think in America it won the Pulitzer Prize. So I think that marked a major change when the ecosystem of literature began to respond to these issues in this way. And since then, certainly I can tell you now, I mean, hardly a day passes when I don't get sent 2 or 3 manuscripts, of books that feature these issues, manuscripts, plays, poetry. I mean, I feel like I'm at the receiving end of an avalanche. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly, and I feel happy, that this has happened. It's what I would have wanted, but at the same time, it's a bit overwhelming for an individual to be dealing with so many requests all the time. But yes, I think things have very seriously changed. I don't think see, after all, writers are well-informed people. They read, they know what's happening in the world. It's not as though you'll find a single writer who's a climate denialist as such. It's just that I think the form itself and the nature of literary life marginalizes these certain issues and certain subjects.
Mm, mm. Fascinating. I totally agree with you about Richard Powers' book, The Overstory. No one could read it and think it isn't deeply serious and remarkable literature. And it is literature which absolutely directly addresses the ecological and climate emergency. So yeah, that's a very hopeful development. Let's come back in a minute to the question of why the literary establishment has sort of got it wrong and in the past and drill into that. But just before we do that, I'm struck by your mentioning of the way that it's not just the weather that has weirded in the last few years, but that also we've had this massive upsurge of popular protest and unrest. And most notably, as you say, in 2018, Greta Thunberg began her school strike and Extinction Rebellion was launched, and those then rose to spiraled to great heights in 2019. I noticed this quote on rereading the book this time, but in preparation for tonight, from the end of the book on page 214, you said this, Amitav: "It's hard to see how popular protest movements could gain enough momentum within such a narrow horizon of time as we have. Such movements usually take years, even decades, to build." Would you have a little bit more hope now than when you wrote that sentence? Do you think that the way that we've seen massive popular movements, not massive enough, but massive popular movements emerge around the climate and ecological emergency, and also perhaps right now the remarkable farmers movement in India, do you think that we are getting at all into the ballpark of where we need to be in terms of addressing from the streets, as it were, the deranged state of the planet?
Well, let me say, first of all, Rupert, I should have, you yourself have been a part of Extinction Rebellion, and you've been a very good spokesperson for them. And, good for you. I think you've done a very good job of that.
Thank you.
But, if you look back on the way that the whole climate emergency has played out, It's literally as if the planet itself were toying with us. You know, around about 2000, when people were beginning to get interested in this issue, suddenly there was apparently a kind of lull in rising temperatures. Everybody lost interest. And that's happened again and again. And I think the latest and cruelest trick that the planet has played with us is this pandemic. I mean, in January 2020, you remember, that was when Greta Thunberg was really amassing a kind of momentum. You know, that was when Extinction Rebellion was amassing a kind of momentum. And suddenly this thing came along, and all of it literally vanished, you know. And it had to, because you know, you couldn't meet anymore. So, you know, this is the thing. This is about all the, you know, the planetary crisis requires a collective response. And you know, look at us now. We are all sitting in our homes. We are completely individuated, even more than before. You know, all of that has literally sort of vanished. Secondly, let me say that, you know, even though there was a significant momentum behind those movements, were the numbers really so great? You know, what were the numbers? You know, I mean, even within Europe, what were the numbers? I don't know. I think the numbers were pretty small. I mean, you know, they did some certain spectacular things and caught a lot of attention, and you know, that was all great. But still, I don't know that the numbers were so great. Thirdly, remember, this was a completely, I mean, on the whole, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg's movements have remained completely focused on the West. I mean, almost all the support comes from the West. You know, and that's really the problem. You know, this planetary crisis cannot be addressed by the West. The West is no longer driving it. You know, the essential drivers of the planetary crisis now are all in the Indian Ocean region, you know. And what was the response to Extinction Rebellion or any of these things in India, in China, in Indonesia, Africa? I would say, you know, there are groups, there are small groups, but it was very far from being a mass movement in, you know, in the global South. Finally, you make this point about the farmers movement in India, which is actually very much addressed to the planetary crisis in every sense. You know, basically they're trying to stop a neoliberal takeover of India's agricultural economy, and actually what India is facing today is a kind of agricultural crisis brought on by you know, another great Western idea, the Green Revolution, which has actually led you know, to the collapse of many kinds of agricultural systems. It's like geoengineering, you know. It's full of promise initially, but it's the unintended consequences, you know, that create this disaster. So 250 million people joined in these protests, but the government has been completely unresponsive. They've been incredibly successful at you know, suppressing and marginalizing this movement, which is the largest movement on the planet, you know, that the planet has ever seen, you know, in human history. See, that's the part we forget. You know, it's governments are more than ready. You know, they've learned how to manipulate and how to suppress a public protest. Remember, just before the COP21 in Paris, how you know, there was that terrorist attack, and within days they had put 40 environmental activists under house arrest. How did they know to do that? How did they get so organized? You know, there's a very interesting book called Green is the New Red. It's by an environmental activist, and it's about you know, the targeting of environmental activists by governments around the world. I mean, everywhere now, you know, environmental activists are on various kinds of lists. You know, so governments have gotten very, very good at marginalizing a protest, in marginalizing dissent. I mean, that's just been one very striking feature of these last few years. Look at what happened in Paris, for example. I mean, they push the protest groups into marginal places. They segregate them. They've learned how to do that very, very well. This is exactly what the government has done in India. It's just taken a leaf out of that playbook. It's created a kind of pen in which these people are sort of herded, and thereby they sort of succeed in defanging the protest, and also by controlling social media and so on. So it is heartening. I agree with you. It's very heartening to see young people especially becoming concerned about these issues. But it's also very disheartening to see how powerless people have become. If you think back 20, 30 years ago, a protest of 250 million people would have overthrown governments and so on. But remember, the turning point was another aspect of the planetary crisis. It was the Iraq War of 2003. There were the largest protests, worldwide protests against the war. But Tony Blair and Bush just disregarded everything and pushed ahead.
What you're speaking about now, Amitav, brings to mind for me your latest book, which I've just had the privilege of reading, Gun Island, which I can strongly recommend to people. What I'm thinking of is the way that the book ends, and I'm going to try not to do a complete spoiler here, but the book ends with a moment of quite sort of dramatic political confrontation between one movement and another on the open ocean, as it happens, because part of the topic of the novel is climate migration, and again, as I say, without giving too much away, it seems as though one of the things that you're trying to do in the way that you end the novel is start to imagine what it might be like if things were to go a bit better than you just described, and the difficulty you have is doing it in a way which people would judge as realistic. And the way that you deal with that difficulty is by not making any attempt, I would say, to be realistic. You move into a kind of different genre. You move beyond the normal confines of the novel, but hopefully in a way that people will still continue to judge, like with Powers, that what you're doing is serious literature, which it very much seems to me that it is. So I just wanted to ask you a question about Gun Island, which is a novel which is palpably a novel, palpably literature, and palpably about climate and ecology in a number of respects. My sense was that what you've really tried to do here, and it seems to me you may have succeeded, is to respond to your own challenge in The Great Derangement. In other words, you've sought here to write a novel which escapes the normal constraints of the novel, but hopefully without getting ghettoized as something like, I don't know, fantasy fiction or something. It doesn't attempt to be in the ordinary sense realistic in a number of ways, but yet it has a kind of nature or character that grips the reader and strikes the reader very strongly as being, as I say, literature. Have I kind of caught on to what you were seeking to do with the novel? Is the kind of response that I'm having to it something like what you were maybe hoping for? And would you agree with me that in some sense one might read Gun Island as in a certain sense your own response to The Great Derangement?
Well, yes, you're absolutely on the mark there. Even while I was writing Gun Island, I often had this. I mean, when I was writing The Great Derangement, I had the sense that I'm writing this book now. How do I respond to all these challenges that I've laid out in the book? And strangely, the sort of idea for Gun Island came very soon after I had finished The Great Derangement, and I felt at the end of writing Gun Island, I felt very satisfied that I felt that I had, in one way or the other, addressed all the challenges that I lay out in The Great Derangement. The challenges about plausibility, the challenge of timescales, the challenge of geographical dispersal. So I felt that, one way or the other, I had at least addressed every aspect of that. But, fundamentally, I think the real challenge that faces the literary world everywhere today, and I would say it's not just the literary world, it's the humanities, it's philosophy, it's every kind of thought, really, is how do we give voice to the non-human? You
Mm,
know,
mm,
how do we give voice to non-human agency? How do we recognize non-human agency? Because that is the fundamental issue about climate change, which is that one day we suddenly look around us and we realize that the earth is a living entity, you
mm,
know, that it is alive and it's actually responding to us as a living entity. When you look at Lovelock's informal writings, this is exactly what he's trying to communicate in the sort of most dramatic way. I mean, he keeps talking about spirit, he keeps talking about animatedness. And this is the really important thing. The Western project in the world for 500 years has been the suppression of all ideas of vitalism. Every idea that the earth, other entities are alive, that they're capable of communication, that they're capable of agency. This has been the fundamental project, intellectual project of the West. You look at how it set about implementing this project, most of all in the Americas. You know, uh, you know, right from the start, the project was to suppress any idea of vitalism. So that actually in a country that's founded upon the idea of religious freedom, in the 1880s, in America, they banned the practice of Native American religion. They forbade them from dancing. They forbade their rituals. They forbade. I mean, all of that was persecuted with such an intensity. It just makes you realize that they themselves did not believe what they thought. You know, and you just look at this entire. You look at the entire birth of these Western intellectual projects. It fundamentally arises out of ideologies of conquest. You know,
mm, mm.
uh, you know, look at the 17th century. What is the background? I mean, basically, it's the great dying of the Americas. You know, it's the conquest of the Americas. It's the suppression of Amerindian identity. It's the killing of Native Americans across the board, and this informs. This creates a sort of loop back into Europe. It's so interesting, for example, that Descartes, even though he was French, actually his entire intellectual life was lived in Holland, which was then the dominant colonial power. So these. It's now we have to try and find our ways back into thinking in pre-17th century ways.
Mm.
These are the only ways in which we can try to recover, the non-human voice. Because certainly, for all our ancestors, the non-human was very much a part of human existence.
Yes, I wondered when I reread the Great Derangement this time and read Gun Island alongside it. I wondered if we might hear there a sort of a different echo or a different nuance of what might be meant by the Great Derangement. And what I'm thinking of is this: that in modernism, there's been this emphasis on weird ways of writing. Which have attracted so much of the kudos. You don't get to be avant-garde unless you write in some way which is most peculiar. And we've had unreliable narrators. We've had what are sometimes called deranged narratives, where the form moves radically from what you had in Jane Austen or whatever. Now, what you seek to give us, among other things, in Gun Island is some of this. Is to try to find a way of listening to the voice of the non-human or giving voice to the non-human. And the thought I had was, from the perspective of modernism, that's crazy. That's really deranged, right? To go beyond the confines of the human and try to voice the non-human. Whereas in a way, it seems to me you're saying in The Great Derangement is, no, the thing that is crazy, the thing that is deranged is the fixation on the human alone, which was actually at the heart of the modernist project. So I wondered if we might see a sort of standoff there between two visions of what it would be to be sane and what it would be to be crazy.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, essentially the whole Enlightenment project was one of centering the human and decentering the non-human in ways that, human beings had never done before. And the even stranger part of that project is that even when they meant human, they didn't actually mean all humans. In fact, they meant a very tiny minority of humans.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, most humans continue to be regarded as, savages or brutes who lived in nature and therefore had no history. So, I mean, in fact, what arises out of Enlightenment humanism is really the centering of the white European male, essentially. Those are actually the only humans. The rest of humanity is not human. I mean, is not regarded as fully human. That's the really remarkable part of it. Even as this whole project of Enlightenment humanism centers the human, it's actually admitting that humans are no different from non-humans, simply because most humans are non-human as far as they're concerned. So, uh, uh, I think we do really have to radically part company, with those ways of thinking. It's interesting in that respect. If you, I heard an interview with Richard Powers where where someone asks him, are you an animist? you know, and he says, I would like to be an animist, but I can't because I wasn't brought up that way. But it's different for me in some serious way. I was brought up as an animist, so it's not hard. It's not that hard for me to, think back into the ways of thinking of that I grew up with.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting to hear. In my little book, This Civilization is Finished, I argue that we are likely to see an upsurging of pantheism or panentheism in the coming generation or two, partly in response to the global ecological crisis. And on my way of seeing it, animism is a sort of micro version, if you will, of pantheism. It sort of localizes the God that pantheism puts in nature into all the individual parts of nature. I wondered though if we could turn to thinking a little bit about how this works, what we're talking about in relation to what you were talking about a while ago, namely the question of the relationship of the collective and the individual. Because something which is absolutely essential to the Great Derangement is the rise of individualism. You talk about the way that the great acceleration, the huge expansion of economies in the 20th century began in the West and now then has moved also to the East. You talk about the way that acceleration has fueled the rise of individualism and the way that most literature didn't question this, but actually went along with this, even celebrated it. You especially focus on this phrase that John Updike uses of the novel as an individual moral adventure. And you want to raise a question mark over that phrase. And clearly some of what you're trying to do and some of what Powers is trying to do is to find alternative ways of doing the novel. In relation, just because it's connected to this, about what you said about COVID a while ago, it seems to me that what COVID has done with the lockdowns and so on is just kind of exaggerated the way we were living already. And I speak here, by the way, as a full proponent of lockdowns as a necessary precautionary measure in countries like the US and the UK and many other countries which horribly messed up their initial response to coronavirus. It wasn't necessary in a few parts of the world to have lockdowns because they managed to strangle coronavirus at birth. But if that wasn't done, then we've had these lockdowns and we've got separated into these silos and we're all, participating in this lecture this evening separately in our own homes. But to me, it seems as though all that COVID has done is made it obvious the way that we were living anyway, which was a kind of crazy way of living where we're all isolated from each other, living in these tiny boxes, without genuine community, without the kind of organic communities that human beings have lived in for the vast majority of their existence on this earth, and which have gone along with forms of beliefs typically such as animism. And I just wanted, for the benefit of those who haven't read The Great Derangement, to give a couple of quotes which it seemed to me strikingly sum up the importance of this theme in the book. So you say on page 108, at exactly the time when it has become clear that global warming is in every sense a collective predicament, humanity finds itself in the thrall of a dominant culture in which the idea of the collective has been exiled from politics, economics, and literature alike, which struck me as powerfully true. And then even stronger, on page 162, you say this: is it possible that the arts and literature of this time will one day be remembered not for their daring, not for being avant-garde, nor for their championing of freedom even, but rather because of their complicity in the Great Derangement? Could it be said that the stance of unyielding rage against the official order that the artists and writers of this period adopted was actually, from the perspective of global warming, a form of collusion? Presumably, this is part of the reason why in some of your presentations of the Great Derangement, you've received a hostile reception, remarks like those.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, you have a lot of questions there, in fact. So, I'll try and get to them one by one. See, on the question of pantheism and animism and so on, let's just talk about the West in this instance. Look, vitalism never actually disappeared, even in the West. I mean, it was suppressed, it was persecuted, and so on, but it never actually disappeared. In fact, it was kept alive by many kinds of intellectuals, I mean, starting with Paracelsus and then going on, through Goethe and so many other figures. It manifested itself in beliefs about occultism, if you like, and so on. So it never actually completely disappeared. I mean, I don't know if you've read the work of this great Italian anthropologist, Ernest de Martino, who studied tarantism. It's very, very interesting work. It's this belief in in communication with spiders, in spirit possession through spiders, tarantulas. So the tarantella comes from that, etc. But it's really completely brilliant work. So within peasant communities, within farming communities, even within Europe, vitalism never disappeared. I mean, so this sort of Cartesianism, this Cartesian sort of dualism, really, who has ever believed it except a very small number of, elite intellectuals? A really tiny number. I mean, did anyone ever really believe that an animal is a kind of machine? I mean, how many people actually believe that, So I would say that, in fact, the curious thing is that none of the vitalist beliefs around the world have never actually disappeared, and they're now coming very forcefully back. In any number of what you might call earth religions, there's a very interesting book called Dark Green Religion.
Yes, it's a great book, super book.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book, it shows you that across the West there are all these new communities of belief starting up. Not all of them are benign. Many of them, many of them are quite straightforwardly eco-fascistic. Many kinds of this sort of neo-paganism, is very distinctly eco-fascistic. But again, there are many other groups which are not, which are actually reclaiming a vitalist heritage. And there again, if you think, it never even disappeared in philosophy. I mean, Alfred North Whitehead worked himself back towards it, saying something in the most convoluted way, but something which most ordinary people in the world have always known, So, I think the real question is that, it's this small intellectual elite who are actually deranged, but they actually have the power. They are in charge. They run the world. So they have the power to impose these beliefs on everybody around them. That is the fundamental question. How did a tiny minority really managed to impose its views upon most humans, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do feel that it's these issues that we have to sort of try and work our way towards, and how we do it, I don't know.
One more quote that's relevant to this, where you take this this emphasis on the destructive nature of this individualism, which has been across the elite, including the literary elite, and you suggestively apply it directly to politics. I want to share with people. Politics is increasingly conceived of, you say, as an individual moral adventure, in the sense of being an interior journey guided by the conscience. Just as novels have come to be seen as narratives of identity, so too politics has become, for many, a search for personal authenticity, a journey of self-discovery. And I heard there a sort of implicit critique of contemporary identity politics, and a worry that contemporary identity politics always risks being a part of this narrow anthropocentrism and individualization, which has characterized so much of the arc of the last few centuries, and which we might perhaps juxtapose to some of the ideas from India, for example, ideas of people such as Tagore or Gandhi, who had a much more place-centered and collective-centered vision of politics, and a vision of politics and of life, which opposed the way in which anthropocentrism seems to depend upon a kind of fantasy of conquest of nature, a fantasy which we see very heavily across Western philosophy in philosophers as diverse as Francis Bacon, Fichte, John Dewey, this fantasy of the conquest of nature, which it seems is now very much coming back to bite us. Would that be a way of describing things that would resonate with you?
Yes. Again, many interesting points and questions. Let me start with the last. This whole idea, again, I don't think it was at all a coincidence that Bacon, for example, was Lord Chancellor at a time when England is basically establishing its colonies in the Americas. The whole project is one of conquest. You see this most clearly, I think, in Bacon, where he actually brings together ideas of genocide and the ideas of conquering nature. You see this in Bacon, you see this in Locke, you see this in the entire sort of pantheon of early Enlightenment intellectuals, and Western culture is just saturated with these ideas. These ideas of conquest and these ideas of conquering nature. You raised the question, you asked me a question about individualism and literature, which I think is actually a very interesting question. And I'd just like to sort of circle back to that.
Yeah.
Look, you think about the ways in which the whole practice of modern literature emerges. Literature, is now individualist in two ways. I, as a writer, sit in my study all by myself, alone, writing a novel which is meant to be read by a reader reading in their own heads. They read silently to themselves. But this is not how historically human beings have read. The whole practice of reading silently emerges only in the late 18th century. Before that, people always read aloud. And they read aloud because they were reading for, groups of people. Similarly, even in the Victorian age in England, for example, people would sit around the fireplace and, read a book aloud. The early novels were also read collectively. Today, nobody does that. It's virtually, that whole practice has disappeared. And if you think about that, now reading is increasingly done on your phone. Increasingly individual, increasingly secret, increasingly private. So the privatization of literature starts, I would say, beginning again in the 18th century. How do we reclaim a sort of collective literary practice? there again, for me, I've returned to a certain kind of pre-modern practice, if you like. At the heart of Gun Island is this legend, this Bengali legend, which is actually very important within Bengali culture. Now, this legend is a collective legend in the sense that it pre-exists any telling of it. It's a very ancient indigenous legend. And it's been told by a number of poets who interlink with each other. So there's no idea of originality there, even though the poets do actually leave their stamp very clearly on the individual tellings of the legend. Again, the legends are told in a metrical form. Each verse has actually a rag, that is a song scale, attached to it. So they were meant to be sung aloud. They were meant to be performed. They were meant to be performed in public. So I became very interested in this in the course of writing Gun Island. And in fact, I've just published a book which comes out next week. It's actually called Jungle Nama. It's an adaptation of a legend from the Sundarban. The Sundarban is a vast mangrove forest, in Bengal. It's an adaptation of a legend, but I've adapted it in verse, and I've collaborated with an artist in the adaptation, and I'm collaborating with a musician, so that there'll be an audio version as well that will be performed publicly. So, trying to find some way of getting out of this individuation. Have you ever read the Native American botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer?
I'm afraid I haven't, but everybody's telling me I should.
You should. She's a really wonderful writer. And, she makes the point that in all indigenous cultures, there are so many stories about balance, about finding a balance between humans and the earth. And she says in English, you'd never find a story like that. English stories in English are all about ambition. They're all about, just do it. Nothing is impossible. Explore, get more, extract. But Jungle Nama is exactly such a story. It's exactly such a legend. And it'll be out in England later this year. So I do think that we have to find ways of, trying to create new forms. This is one thing that I said in the Great Derangement. I also have, I could also address the question of identity politics, if you like. I mean, but unless you have other questions that you'd like.
Take a couple of minutes on that, and then I've got one more question, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Yeah.
I think it's possible for identity politics to become very individual-centered, to become very much interiorist. But at the same time, it also creates a lot of ground for solidarities. I think one of the really incredibly moving things about this pandemic, for me living here in New York, is to see the Black Lives Matter protests. Which transcended identity altogether. Certainly here in Brooklyn, there were more white people participating than Black people. I mean, it was a completely sort of transracial sort of movement. And I think intellectually, the movement had a very profound influence. I think we'll be feeling its influence for really years to come. I mean, it changed practices in economics. It changed practices in history, in the writing of history. So I think we're going to see major changes coming out of those protests.
Very interesting. Yes.
Another thing I would say is that, this is actually not just, Black Lives Matter has been preceded, by other movements, anti-globalization protests starting in the 1990s. The Occupy movement, I think, was a very important influence. But most of all, the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, it was spearheaded by indigenous women. And those movements have had an incredible staying power. Year after year, against the most brutal kinds of persecution. People have returned to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. What is very interesting, the thing that binds all these movements together, if you ask me, with with Extinction Rebellion and so on, is that they're all about inhabiting. occupy was about inhabiting. How do you inhabit a space? The Dakota Access Pipeline, at one point it was the fourth largest settlement in the Dakotas. So, I think that's a very important and interesting thing. I mean, Extinction Rebellion similarly has created metaphors out of occupation.
Yes.
I think the most important thing, though, is that they must dance. I
Mm.
think dancing is, just think of how, it's the most powerful way of challenging dominant structures, dominant modes of thought. It's a way of connecting with the earth. It's a way of inhabiting. In the Dakota Access Pipelines, dances were very important because dancing is such an important part of Native American culture and indeed of indigenous cultures everywhere. Remember how profoundly threatening Native American ghost dancing was to the American state in the
Mm.
19th century. You know, I really feel that, I love the way that they're doing performances, they're doing readings, they're doing all those things for Extinction Rebellion. I think most of all now, they must start occupying with dance. I say this as someone who can't dance at all.
Well, that's a fascinating recommendation, which I will pass on. And certainly it fits with the way I introduced this evening when I said we're not just going to have long faces because we're faced with these crises. We're going to try to find positive ways through them. The last question I want to ask before we get to the Q&A is taking up again this question of the example of India, which is an important example to you in the book. One of the very fascinating moves you make in the book is you do this kind of thought experiment. You say, imagine if India and China, etc., had decolonized a generation or so earlier, after the First World War rather than the Second World War. What would have been the effect on the climate situation? And you speculate, you argue quite strongly that what it would have led to would have been an earlier acceleration of the climate emergency because countries like India would have industrialized quicker. But in philosophy, a view that we have about counterfactuals is that when you change one thing, you have to also be willing to consider the possibility that other things will change as well. So can I put to you this thought? Imagine that India had indeed decolonized in the early 1920s rather than the late 1940s. Is it not possible that the different state of the country at that point and the different state of the leadership of the independence movements might have taken India in quite a different direction? So what I have in mind here is that in 1920, say, Gandhi is at the height of his powers, Tagore is still alive, Aurobindo has a lot of influence, whereas people like Nehru and Ambedkar, the arch modernizers, they were barely out of short trousers. Is it not possible that with more intact communities as India had at that time, and with a greater sort of inheritance of frugality, that India might have taken a different path and a less destructive path if it had become independent at this time? And of course, one reason I'm asking the question, one reason it would matter if my alternative counterfactual history is sort of on the right track, is if it is possible that India might have taken a better path then, maybe that might give us some hope that it or other countries might take a better path in the future soon, in the changed world that we're going to be moving into, a world that may be more conducive to, I don't know, animism, pantheism, a world that may be more determined to seek to rebuild community. What would you say, Amitav?
That's an interesting question. You have to remember that even in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the early 19th century, many Indians were really keen on industrializing. The Indian elite was very, very keen on industrializing. In fact, the British Raj recognized this and systematically suppressed the emergence of an industrial economy in India. And one of the ways it did this was by suppressing the key sector of industrialization, which is weapons making. There's a very interesting book published in 2018 by this historian from Stanford, Priya Satya, called Empire of Guns. And it shows basically that, the Industrial Revolution is fundamentally driven by weapons making. I mean, Samuel Galton essentially financed a Watt and all the other Bolton and all the other inventors. And most of these inventions were actually pioneered in weapons factories. At that point in time, India's weapons industry was very advanced, but the East India Company killed it because it understood, that weapons making is the key industry. So it killed it by flooding the Indian market with Western-made weapons. And so it killed. So, look, what would have happened if India had industrialized earlier? Of course, it's a counterfactual. But remember what has happened in post 1990. It's a very tiny expansion in the carbon footprint of per capita carbon footprint of Indians, Chinese, Indonesians, that has led to this massive rise in greenhouse gas emissions. So even if a very small number of Indians and Chinese had actually adopted the carbon economy, let's say going back to 1910 or even the 1920s, already then the scientific evidence would have started pouring in time for us to recognize the nature of the crisis. Remember also that in the 1920s and 30s, people were not as carbon dependent as they are now. It would have been easier to decarbonize then. Today, it's almost impossible because everything is carbon dependent. Everything, every aspect of our lives. We can barely stir a limb, without drawing on carbon in one way or the other. So if this threat had been recognized earlier, if it had been established earlier, of course, it had been recognized by individual scientists, but it hadn't been recognized by political structures. So in 1990, what do we get? We get the Washington Consensus, which is fundamentally pushing upon the whole world the idea that everybody must live like Americans. Everybody must have essentially the same carbon footprint. Basically what it pushes upon the world is extractivism. It's fundamentally settler colonialism. So today what we have in India is absolutely the adoption of a settler colonial ethos. I mean, to a degree to which is almost unimaginable. The way that the government is now dismantling environmental protections, the way that it's opening up, indigenous lands for extractivist industries. This is happening in India. This is happening in China. This is happening in Indonesia. So what has actually happened since the 1990s is that the Washington Consensus succeeded in converting the whole world into adopting these settler colonial models of economy and life.
Yes. It's as if India has recolonized itself. I mean, if one reads Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, he would be so horrified at the recent path of India. But I guess what was behind my question was the thought, isn't it possible to conceive of India at a slightly earlier stage, taking a somewhat different path and actually holding on to that part of the vision of the sort of community-oriented vision of Gandhi, the nature philosophy of Tagore, etc. Is it not possible to conceive of that as having more power if things had started sooner, before the Nehrus of this world became the leaders of the movement?
No, I really don't think so. You know why? Because, look, what is happening in the world is fundamentally mimetic. In the sense that today, if you ask, a middle-class Indian, if they're willing to make significant cuts to their lifestyles, what will their response be? Their response will be, why should I make a cut when they over there have made no cuts already? Their carbon footprints are like 10 times the size of mine. Why should I make a cut? So it is in that sense mimetic. It wouldn't have worked if it was coming only out of India. What is the single most important thing is that Westerners, people with large carbon footprints, have to shrink their carbon footprints. They have to live
absolutely.
in a different way.
Yeah.
They just have to live in a different way. Until that happens, nothing will change. I mean,
Yes.
I
Until leadership is shown in that sense by the West or the global North, we have absolutely no leg to stand on in suggesting to the rest of the world that they shouldn't follow our path.
absolutely zero.
Yeah.
It's absolutely zero. So, I mean, basically, the only thing that would work is degrowth in the West.
Yeah.
As far as I can see, that's the only thing that would work
Yeah.
in setting a different global model. But there again, I must say that I see something interesting again in movements like Occupy, Extinction Rebellion, and the no access pipeline, and so forth. Because actually, what is so interesting about these movements is that they're trying to perform a different way of life. You know, and I think that is very, very important.
Yeah.
That that people think of a different way of living, because there's no way, if Westerners continue to live as they do, there's no way that Indians and Asians will stop.
Yes.
I
And
mean, as
certainly
someone
that,
from there, I can tell you, I mean, I see this.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For me, that has been one of the most exciting and enriching aspects of being involved in Extinction Rebellion, has been the way that a lot of Extinction Rebellion actions have been prefigurative and regenerative. And when you take part in them, they're really fun, but it's much more than fun. There's a deep sort of joy, and it really sort of enriches your sense of what is possible for human beings to do. And I wasn't really anticipating that necessarily before it started, but that was absolutely strikingly, for example, a feature of what it was like to be in London in April 2019. And that's something which I think that most rebels would say, that really stays with people, that aspect of the experience.
I can well imagine that. Yes, you can sense that in a way, it's almost like an ecstatic movement, I mean, and I think those are the things. Look, at the end of the day today, we have to pull some slender shreds of hope out of the sky, out of an increasingly dark horizon. And I think that's where I would hang my hat. I think that it's, these various earth religions, these
Yeah.
other movements, if they can create any kind of interconnection. And most of all, I would say the really great beacon is Pope Francis, who returns to these issues again and again and says that, the whole issue of what is a good life. He comes back to that again and again and says,
Yes.
you have to stop this acquisitive idea of
Yes.
what a good life is. So,
and you have this wonderful section towards the end of the Great Derangement where you contrast Pope Francis's Laudato Si with the Paris Agreement, and you argue that the Laudato Si is a far more beautiful document, but not only that, you argue it's a far more realistic document, and that the Paris Agreement, by contrast, is full of obfuscation, managerialism, and various other kind of deformations of our time.
yeah, sadly, it's true. I mean, after all, what is it? What is it? I mean, you know, Kevin Anderson's critiques of the Paris Agreement are everywhere for anyone to see. He shows you that it's not going to be effective, even if it's adopted. And of course, it hasn't been adopted by the most important countries like America. So, and in any case, it's based upon these speculative technologies, BECS, carbon capture,
Yeah.
and so on. However, one mustn't dismiss it altogether. It was an important achievement. It did something important. It brought a lot of countries together. Let's just hope that these other groups that there can be an awakening brought about by Pope Francis, by all the young people who you've been working with inspirational figures like Greta Thunberg and so on.
Yeah.
Let's just hope that they can create a global change in consciousness.
Yes. So there we go. That's the best we've done so far in terms of silver linings. Now let's see what we can come up with in terms of the fascinating questions we've been getting from our audience. So I want to start with Molly, who's asked a series of of wonderful questions. I'm going to pick out the one which I think is central. Molly asks, do you think we can give voice adequately to the non-human with the current language that we have? Is it possible to do what we're trying to do or hoping for, or what you're trying to do, without some more radical reform to the very way that we think or the very words that we use? Do you have a view on that question, Amitav?
You know, that's a very interesting question. It's a very fundamental question. You know, I told you at the end of the Great Derangement, I conclude really by saying that, you know, we as writers have to start finding other ways, other forms, other means of writing and thinking. And at that point, I really wanted to go back to pre-modern narratives. You know, unfortunately, since I speak and read Bengali, I was able to go back to pre-modern Bengali narratives. And the reason why I felt it was very important to do this is simply because I do feel that English is so profoundly implicated in modernity, as indeed are most European languages, that it's perhaps impossible to extricate, you know, that aspect of the silencing of the non-human from modern Western languages. Actually, Robin Wall Kimmerer has many interesting examples of this from Native American languages. You know, she points out at one in one of her chapters that she's a formally trained botanist, and she said it was interesting for her to see that botany has a name for so many kinds of. It has names for everything to do with certain plants. What it doesn't have a name for, and what Native American languages have a name for, is the force that pushes the plant up. You know, I mean, every aspect of that vitalism is somehow missing, you know, in within the vocabulary. So yes, I do think it's important. But again, you know, human civilization offers us so many resources, you know. So, you know, so many languages have such a rich pre-modern resources. I mean, it's true of Italian, it's true of Greek. I mean, and if you look at pre-modern Italian narratives, they're also, you know, filled with all kinds of vitalist presences, you know.
Is asks another question about literature. Is asks this: has the prevalence of satire or dystopian literature become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Are we lacking sufficient hopeful visions for the future in literature?
You know, I must say that I find this whole thing about utopias and dystopias very kind of interesting and also troubling. When, after all, does the whole genre come into being? Comes into being in the 16th and 17th centuries, you know. You have Sir Thomas More, you have Francis Bacon, you know, writes his own utopia. You have all these sorts of utopias coming into being then. And what is the fundamental foundation of these utopian imaginings? It's always an empty place, you know. Already there, you can see the colonial stamp, you know. It's an absolute, you imagine an empty place, and then within this place, you build up this utopia. But nowhere on earth is there an empty place. There has never been an empty place anywhere on earth. So the foundation of this genre is based upon the elimination of natives, you know. So actually what they imagine as utopias were absolutely dystopias, you know, in some profoundly fundamental sense. So I think, you know, I have a lot of trouble with this genre of, I think it's a companion genre of colonialism, you know.
But I think perhaps what Is partly has in mind is something which has also troubled me, which is a slightly different point, which is that what we actually find a lot of today is dystopias. And these dystopias, some of them are incredibly valuable. For me, for example, The Road by Cormac McCarthy has been a very important work, devastating work of literature. But there is something troubling if we get dystopia after dystopia, or apocalypse after apocalypse, and we don't get stories which seek to vision how we might find some kind of way through what's coming. And something which I've written about in the past couple of years is, where are the artists who are showing us how we might start to think of, imagine, conceptualize, move towards, figure a way through what's coming, not just warning us about how awful it could be, but showing us something a little bit more gritty and a little bit more difficult, maybe about the way from here to there. And in particular, it seems to me really quite scandalous that there's virtually none of this in what remains the great popular medium of our time, i.e. television. There just aren't any shows which, any TV shows which have put climate front and center. And when they do feature it, they usually either sort of belittle it or turn it into a complete apocalypse. What's your thinking on that, Amitav? Are you concerned about the prevalence of dystopias compared to not utopias, but sort of works that somehow sit in the middle somewhere, perhaps a bit like Ursula Le Guin's classic, The Dispossessed, which is a sort of dystopia combined with a utopia. But the thing about the utopia that she sketches is that it only gets to be utopia because it gets continually remade. It's not a sort of solid state that people arrive at. It's something that they have to work at year after year in order to hold on to any of it.
Look, apocalypse and apocalyptic thinking are a very old part, especially of Christian thought, So it's always been there in some way, and it's manifesting itself in different ways today. And you're right, it's very much present within contemporary writing in so many different ways. I'm actually rather struck by how, when you look at the shows, the popular shows and serials, so many of them are actually set in post-apocalypse, climate apocalypse, various kinds of apocalypse, I mean, that's become a big genre. But, at the same time, other kinds of writing do exist. I mean, Richard Powers' book is largely about activism, In the same way, I like to think that my Gun Island actually has activism at its core. So I don't think one necessarily has to sit down and imagine, a society, where you can see what is important is that you can see people finding meaning in their lives, even when those lives are difficult. And when has human life not been difficult? I mean, the Buddha begins by positing sorrow as the fundamental condition of humanity, So, of course, what lies ahead will be difficult. Who ever imagined that it wouldn't be? And this is, of course, again, some of the rubbish that comes from modernity, this promise that things will always get better. No. Anyone with any common sense will know that things will not always get better. I mean, that's the real thing. It's neither dystopia or utopia. That is the human condition, and it's in that condition that we have to find some meaning, So I would say that certainly my Gun Island is intended to be just that, about people finding meaning in very, very difficult circumstances, the circumstances we are evidently heading towards.
Yeah, I must say, I do find it really encouraging that we have had some significant literature, and I'm thinking especially of Gun Island and of the Overstory in the last few years, which is, as you say, about activism centrally, not just about the climate and ecological emergency, but about activism. That is encouraging. Joe asks a question which I think challenges some of the things that both you and I have said in this conversation, Amitav. It's quite an interesting question, I think. Joe asks this: would it not make sense to frame ecological crisis in an anthropocentric way, even if we, by which I think he means maybe like us here in this lecture this evening, even if we don't see it that way? And I take it he has in mind something like, if we don't frame it anthropocentrically, we're not going to achieve a wide enough appeal. And then he asks, or is serious change in this way needed? More difficult and potentially polarizing reframing required to include the plight of animals in the minds of those who are currently unconcerned. If we really are going to try to go beyond anthropocentrism, are we going to try, as it were, to have to up the ante? What do you think, Amitav?
This is a question fundamentally about solutions, solutions and activism and, putting out the message, as it were. I find that messaging is not something that I know much about. You are an activist, and I really admire and respect you for that. I would not call myself an activist. Maybe if I had been 20 or 30 years younger, I would have been, but I'm not. But I think, this is the question about messaging. And look, I don't think the problem is messaging. I know that many of my climate scientist friends and others in the climate community think it's about messaging. But I really don't think that's the case. I think the really frightening thing is that everyone knows. Everyone already knows.
Yeah, that is pretty frightening if it's true, and it's when you put it like that and just starkly, it sounds quite credible. I guess the hope that is present in my recent work is that we can, in messaging terms, we can sort of split the difference, in the sense that I've argued that what we should do is seek to achieve mass appeal through a sort of enlightened anthropocentrism, by saying, look, if you really want to do what's good for humanity, if you really want to do what's good for your children, then what you need to do is something which takes much more seriously other animals and ecosystems, because we're nothing without them. And then you can achieve a kind of convergence of these apparently different messages. And my hope, insofar as I've got hope around this, would be if we manage to get somewhere with that kind of line of thinking, that actually enlightened self-interest, wise anthropocentrism in practice coincides with biocentrism and ecocentrism, then that might be a way around your disturbing thought a moment ago that actually everybody knows. Because the thing, it seems to me, we really need to confront people with is the thought that if you really do know it, then you are knowingly creating cataclysm much worse than we already have for your children and your grandchildren. And that is incompatible with the self-image of virtually all human beings, as mammals, as primates, as human beings, as beings who say things like, what matters to me above all else is my love for my children.
Well, I think you may well be right. I hope you're right. But I think, if you look at human history, I mean, it's not a very edifying story, really. I mean, if you look at, say, slavery, caste, colonialism, all of that stuff, I mean, people were and are involved in all those forms of being, knowing perfectly well that it imposes immense suffering on millions of people, on others. So I think this idea that somehow awakening people's morality will make them act, I don't know. I don't see much evidence for it in the past.
If we look at the work of yourself, and if we look at a book like The Overstory, and there are other examples that could be mentioned, it seems to me that many of the most important films in recent years do something similar. They are, it seems to me, partly about this process of awakening, of a sort of moral awakening, spiritual awakening. Sometimes it's individual, sometimes it's collective. In terms of films, I'm thinking of films such as Avatar, I'm thinking of Gravity, I'm thinking of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and there are various other examples one could cite. I'm thinking of Lars von Trier's Melancholia. Is there any silver lining? Is there any hope to be found in the thought that if we can get literature and film that is in some cases, really appealing to mass audiences, to, if you will, sort of model or enable the kind of experience of awakening that we're talking about or hoping for here. Is it possible that this could be a really serious task, if you will, for the arts, a task which has been, I think, largely shirked by modernism, but is perhaps coming into its own in some parts of the field of literature and film and maybe music in recent years?
Look, I must say for myself, I've always felt very suspicious of apocalyptic thinking. And a long time ago, I actually said to myself that as an ethical choice, I will avoid apocalypticism. So many of my books could have ended in apocalypse, but I never ended them in that way. And similarly, Gun Island doesn't end in that way. So I think, yes, it's very important really to give people ideas of how they might connect with others, how they might, and it's very important to imagine those connections. It's very important to imagine how those connections might arise. But I do think that actually, there are some important films and so on which do this. I don't know if you've seen a film called First Reformed. It's
Oh,
a very
yes.
good film, and
Very
it's again
powerful.
it's about a priest who suffers this kind of climate awakening and wonders what his life is worth. And the other day I saw another film, quite by chance, which actually struck me as a really good climate film. It's all about climate, really, but it's never listed as such. It's called The Rising Tide. And it's about sort of the effects of Hurricane Sandy on a family, and how it sort of resonates through their lives for a long time. And it's actually a quite uplifting film. So yes, I think these stories do exist, but they don't get pulled into the sort of wider narrative, that's out there.
A question from Linda. Is there an importance in authors' personal connection to the natural world? Is it that rather than the literary aspects of, as it were, of fiction itself, which can bring about ecological awareness? If I've understood the question correctly, I take it that what Linda is getting at is the way in which so much of modern art and literature has seemed deliberately, sort of unbelievably kind of divorced from nature. And is there something powerful or possible in exploring the opposite of that? And perhaps we've had a little bit of that in the COVID crisis. That certainly there's been a strong sense here in the UK under lockdown of many people finding enormous solace and importance in their gardens, in growing food, in getting access to whatever countryside they can get access to, and in being able to hear the birds sing more because there's less traffic and so on and so forth. Is it possible that there's a kind of resurgence of connectivity to the natural world, both in real life and in literature, which could point in a different direction to the, if you will, sterility of so much modernist writing?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting question, and it's really true. I mean, especially in the last 30 years, exactly as this crisis was accelerating, how completely urban centered literature has become, and this is true even of India. An earlier generation of Indian writers, several earlier generations of Indian writers would write about landscapes, they would write about forests, they would write about rivers. It's a very important tradition, of writing. But today, Indian writing is all about the same stuff that Western writing is about people living in cities and having interior crises and so on and so forth. So much of it is about that. It is true. I mean, there are a lot of people. Paul Kingsnorth is a very good example, who feel that getting back to the land gives you a different imaginary and a different way of thinking about things. I respect that point of view, but it's a point of view that, that is a very, how shall I say, comes out of basically a European and American experience. for people who live in very crowded places like Bengal, how do you get back to the land? Especially when the land itself is eroding in front of your eyes, when it's literally being swarmed.
Yes.
You know,
Yes. Although something which is a very powerful aspect of Gun Island and also of the Hungry Tide is your beautiful depiction of the Sundarban and of the wildlife there. The iconic figure in the Hungry Tide is a tiger, and in Gun Island it's a cobra, and of course you've got the dolphin crucially in the background in both. It seems to me that one of the things that you try to do with your fiction repeatedly is to bring these very metropolitan characters into a stark confrontation with nature, read in tooth and claw. And these are some of the moment with the tiger in the Hungry Tide is just unbelievably powerful, and similar moments with the cobra in Gun Island. And the way those moments strike me, at any rate, is that it's very much not as if the metropolitan or the city base is being celebrated at this point. It's being typically shown certain kinds of pretty extreme inadequacies, and you're giving us a strong sense, it seems to me, of the need for a sort of groundedness in the natural world, of a kind of connectivity to the wild, and, as we were saying earlier, the possibility of being able to, if you will, hear the voices of these creatures, literally in the case of the dolphins.
Well, yes, you're right. A lot of my books have these characters who are essentially, urban, but who find themselves in the countryside or in forests or whatever, and it's a great shock to them. And those figures are basically just like me. I grew up in cities. I'm completely a city person. I've always, there's very few places that are more urban than Calcutta. But I don't know why, but I've always been interested in these other landscapes. And for me, the Sundarban, with which actually I also have a long connection since my childhood, I think in many ways the Sundarban has just drawn me back again and again, and and it's from the Sundarban really that I started thinking. It's because of the Sundarban that I started thinking about climate change, because way back when you could already see the impacts there.
Yeah, and the Sundarban, of course, are absolutely vital in terms of protection of the urban areas that are further inland from them. If we lose the mangrove swamps, etc., we lose vast amounts of land. It's one of the most crucial things that we can do, is to defend against the sea-based impacts of climate, is to defend those kinds of swamps.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. A question here from Sam, a question focused on political economy. If economic systems inflect our political systems, this is a problem. If capitalism is based on personal acquisition, focused on the individual, focused on the human, positioned as subject, surely there is no kind of political system inflected upon it that escapes this problem. Even with the best of our imaginations, the power that it concentrates in individuals seems to strip these individuals from a sense of relation to the other. Do you think just focusing on intersubjectivity alone, without tackling political systems which work against a fair intersubjective reality, is enough?
Well, let me say straight away that I do not believe that that to focus on intersubjectivity is enough. No, not at all. No way. Obviously, it's the systems that we have to address. And when we speak of these systems, almost automatically, the system that comes to the front of everyone's mind is capitalism. And of course, capitalism is vitally important. I mean, it's a vitally important driver of climate change. But capitalism itself is enclosed within a system of relationships that are much broader. And these are fundamentally geopolitical relationships, relationships of power, which obtain across the world. These are relationships of extreme inequality. These are Power is the most unequally distributed thing that there is on this planet. I don't think that we can actually abstract capitalism from these other relationships of power and inequality. So, I do feel, you know, Cedric Robinson, who wrote the Black Marxist tradition and who coined the entire concept of racial capitalism and so on. He asks in his book why it is that the Western radical imagination is so preoccupied with capitalism, as opposed to all these other relationships of colonialism, imperialism, war making, and so on, which are actually prior to capitalism. It's these relationships which allow capitalism to exist. And he argues that really it's because for Western intellectuals don't like to deal with the real nastiness, you know. And I think it's true. I think, Western intellectuals find it easier to think of abstract economic systems than to deal with these relationships of power that actually make these abstract economic systems possible.
Very interesting. So part of what you're saying there is that if we're going to, as it were, decolonize our own imaginations, we need to move beyond as single-minded a focus on capitalism as in some quarters there is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would absolutely say that. So,
well, then, yeah, go on, Amitav.
I mean, fundamentally, what is driving this this crisis? It's the crisis of inequality.
Yeah.
You know, it's exactly that. I mean, at every level, within nations, but most of all between nations. Why does India and China want to have a large carbon footprint? It's because of all the stuff that comes with it.
Yeah, yeah, and because of mimesis, as you said earlier. Okay, we're moving towards the end now. Here's a question which is nice because it returns to what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about activism and popular movements and so forth, and it could again offer us a little bit of a silver lining type idea, maybe. It's from Lucy. Lucy says, do you think the problem is that the majority of people are just waiting for, quote, the establishment, unquote, to do something about it? And I guess my way of seeing that question would be, is the problem that too many people are still thinking that they can outsource their concern about the climate and ecological emergency, that the establishment or the government or the politicians are going to take care of it, or maybe the activists are going to sort it out for them, or maybe the scientists are going to find a way of getting it dealt with properly? And are we perhaps getting to the point where people are starting to realize that actually there is no cavalry riding to the rescue, that if we carry on outsourcing the problem in this kind of way, then the problem is going to sweep us away? So is the problem that we haven't got enough people yet who are at that point of realizing that that kind of outsourcing is not going to cut the mustard anymore? And might that be in the process of changing? Do you see any signs of that, Amitav?
Look, if you take a sort of good hard look at the world, how many establishments are there that are actually capable of confronting something like this? England and Britain and America have held themselves up as the sort of global standard for best practices for generations, and look how completely they failed with this COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
I think in a sense, the COVID pandemic is a good indicator of the way that the climate change impacts are going to unfold. Countries where there exists some basis of social trust or some trust in institutions and in governments will be able to at least resist in some way or adjust in some way. But I think, out of complacency or whatever, Many countries that appear to be extremely advanced and rich and so on will actually be very badly affected,
Mm.
simply because they will not be able to put together policies and so on. One of the countries which is sort of preparing for climate change in the most active way is Singapore. Now, Singapore has, they have three environmental humanities programs, and their government, is completely focused on climate change, absolutely focused. And, actually, I heard a Singaporean journalist say something which is very striking. And what he said is that climate change is about the will to power. And I think that is really, it's a kind of perceptive thing to say. I think countries where they're able to sort of organize in that way, it doesn't necessarily mean that ordinary Singaporeans are very well informed about climate change. They're not. I mean, they don't think about it much. That it's not a subject that is much discussed. But as a society, as a collectivity, they are extremely prepared, and they're preparing very hard. Uh, Another country that's preparing very very well is the Netherlands. You know,
Yeah.
Denmark.
They've got long experience.
They have long experience. Yes, they have very long experience, and they're preparing extremely well. So I don't think the equations are very simple.
Yeah.
I think the way that this is going to play out is going to be extremely complicated, and I think it's not going to fit the predictable playbooks. You
Yeah.
know, the climate movement has for long said that, oh, affluent countries will be fine. It's the poor countries that will be affected worst. I think this is a terrible message. It's a terrible message. Again, if this message is based upon the idea that somehow you'll shame the rich into doing something about climate. When have the rich ever been shamed into doing anything? I mean, it's an absurd idea, and it's not even true. You know, and I think this is the thing that this pandemic shows us. Which are the countries that have done best? Sierra Leone is number 2 on the list. Vietnam is number 1. You know, I mean, at the height of this crisis, Somalia was sending doctors to Italy. You know, so I think we should really look at this carefully and think about what it tells us for the future. I think this pandemic has really revealed something completely new about the world, which is
Yeah.
that all those conditions which the Western elites have long stigmatized as underdevelopment and backwardness and so on and so forth, are actually also create forms of resilience. I mean, right now it's easier to get a vaccine in Calcutta than it is in New York. I mean, in fact, in India now, there seems to be, or at least some people are saying that there's some kind of herd immunity because the rate of transmission has dropped off so dramatically. So, I think the way these things are going to play out, and it's not at all predictable. Countries that have experience of hardship, that have experience of coping with difficult times, I think in many ways they'll be better prepared because they know that life isn't easy.
Yeah.
When I look around in America, everyone's furious. They don't want to put on masks. Why? Because they're not used to it. It's not their way of life. It's not what they. I mean, these are the absurdities that affluence sometimes creates, or what we call affluence. Let me say.
Yes, I mean, the US in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and more generally really looks like an empire in decline. And the UK doesn't look a lot better. I was very struck by the way that you were giving us some messaging advice there a couple of minutes ago, contrary to your earlier disclaimers. And I think it's quite credible that it's an incredibly simplistic and misleading message to say, oh, the rich countries are going to be fine. As you say, the coronavirus pandemic, maybe this is going to be an inflection point in more ways than one. Maybe it's the high water mark of globalization. Maybe it's the high water mark of air travel. And maybe it's the high water mark, or perhaps a little bit past the high water mark, for quite a lot of countries such as the US that have taken themselves to be masters of the universe. But I'm also struck, Amitav, as I look back over the conversation we've had this evening, by the way that I've repeatedly tried to push us down the path of looking for silver linings, and you've quite often sort of resisted that. And you've given us, I think, really a pretty kind of relentlessly sort of, I would see it as a realistic picture of our predicament and where we are and where we're likely to be heading. The kind of relentless realism that I've pursued, for example, in this civilization is finished. And in that book, I argue that that because of the reality of how tough the situation is, one of the things that we need to do, as well as trying to transform our civilization so that it doesn't collapse, is to be ready for the possibility that collapse may occur, and to try to relocalize and to try to deeply adapt for that reason. So can I ask you as a very final question now, what's your take on that? Given, if I've been hearing you right this evening, and others in the audience perhaps as well, in not being super optimistic about what's in store for the world over the next generation or two, do you see us as needing to do a lot more by way of considering worst case scenario outcomes and of adapting rather than only mitigating?
I was listening to a talk of yours this morning where you talk quite extensively about Jem Bendel and the whole deep adaptation narrative, and I found it interesting. I think Jem Bendel's work is interesting. You know, I mean, he's saying what he thinks. All of us should say what we think, you know, without worrying about messaging. And I see constantly Jem Bendel being attacked by climate scientists and technocrats and so on, saying he's creating doomism and alarmism and so on. You know, the problem really is that, look, we have to accept that this thing, this planetary crisis, is the biggest thing that has ever been for us as a species. Obviously, people are going to have lots of different ideas about it, you know? And obviously, they must say what they think, you know? You can't dictate to people that they should think one thing or another. It simply doesn't make sense. And they're not going to listen to you, and you're not going to have much success over there. So, you know, whether alarm, whether there's I just saw a climate scientist saying the other day that, oh, you shouldn't talk about panic. And then he said, oh, you can only talk about panic in the way that Greta Thunberg talks about panic. You know, I mean, come on. And you're setting up such a narrow window of what people can say. I mean, come on, it's absurd, you know. So I personally avoid all that stuff by, you know, not talking about the question of how bad it's going to be, or, you know, because frankly, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not, I can't make those kinds of projections. I would say, however, though, that, you know, just as scientists are able to talk about the atmosphere's sensitivity to greenhouse gases and so on, I think, you know, doing the kind of work that I've done and reading the sorts of histories that I've done, I think I can say that, you know, we should expect that the social and political sensitivity to climate change is much greater than we imagine. You know, so already we can see really around the world the incredible disruption of political systems.
Yeah.
I mean, who could have imagined, you know, that Britain, which has for, you know, centuries been a sort of beacon of political stability, would become so deeply sort of troubled, you know, in a course of 10 or 15 years. Who would have thought this of America? And, you know, we should not for a moment imagine that these are disconnected developments. In the background, as Bruno Latour says, in the background of everything that is happening today, there is climate change. You know, it's in the background of everything. One of the reasons why people in Britain and in America are so despondent and so focused now on identity issues is simply because they can see that they won't have the lives that their parents had. They see this economically, they can see this in terms of, they see this environmentally, They see this imaginatively, and they won't. I mean, I see this with my son's generation. I mean, they all take for granted that they won't have the lives that, the same sort of, how should I say, increase in acquisitiveness or acquisitions that, So our generation, we've, in a way, lived off the fat of the land. And everyone who comes after us can see that they won't have those lives. And it's crushing. It's
Yeah.
absolutely crushing. I mean, people are crushed under it, and they uh, they're placing the blame everywhere except where they should. They place the blame on immigrants. They on racial minorities, on on sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. But the real problem is that everybody can see that the horizons are closing. Is it possible to have meaningful lives within narrower horizons? I would say absolutely it is. We don't need all that stuff in order to have meaningful lives. We can live differently.
But what you're very much bringing out there, Amitav, is the same theme that is present in my work, which is that while a lot of people are talking about things like sea level rise and so on, and what's happening in the polar regions, which of course is terrifying. Actually, the time horizons in terms of the impacts of the climate emergency could be a lot faster. I mean, I see political and democratic crises potentially spiraling out of control in a number of so-called developed countries in the not too distant future. And I also see the very real possibility in perhaps large parts of the world within a generation of vulnerabilities expressed through, for example, food shortages. And that, it seems to me, is likely to hit us really hard way before sea level rise has actually impacted a very large number of people. So to sort of repeat that part of my question finally, would you agree with me that that actually, in terms of the kind of perspective we need now, in terms of what we do about the climate emergency, it's so clearly now not enough anymore to just be thinking about, oh well, how do we get a really good agreement in Glasgow, and how do we mitigate more effectively and achieve net zero by 2050? This is about much more short to medium term potential threats, which will potentially take quite chaotic and unpredictable forms, whether through politics or through food or through water shortage.
I completely agree. Look, I think it's important to have, events like the Glasgow meeting. I think it's important to think about mitigation. I think all those things are very important, even if only in a ritualistic sense, simply because, to reassure people. People are terrified around the world. People are frightened, deeply frightened. And it's important just for a sense of reassurance to go through some sorts of rituals of normality, But yeah, at the same time, I agree. I think all of us who've looked at these issues carefully, we've all recognized that a great unraveling was coming, and I think I think what we did not understand and did not expect, certainly I did not, is that it would come so soon. And certainly, being here in the United States through these last 6 months, it's really felt like an unraveling. And in a sense, there is, of course, the issue of climate. There's food shortages. There's all of that, but also there is the issue of technology. I think these social media and these new communications technologies have destabilized society so profoundly that we perhaps will not know how profoundly we've been destabilized. Just look at all these rumor mills, all this sort of fake news that's all out there. In so many ways, it's exactly like the 17th century, which is again, a time of climatic disruption, when again society proved, political and social systems proved to be much more sensitive to just a 1 degree change, 1 degree change, and half the population disappears in certain places, empires fall. There are revolutions. In England, you have your civil war. I mean, you have the 30 Years' War. You have the Ming being overthrown. You have uprisings in Russia. So, I think society is much, much more sensitive to climate than we imagine. And I think, these, I don't think we're going to come through this, with all the social and political structures that we've built. I don't think they'll come through them intact. I think we're seeing already a sort of a profound upheaval,
Yeah. Well, on that realistic and slightly somber note, I'm going to bring things towards a close. These issues that Amitav and I have been discussing for 2 hours now, thank you so much for the huge numbers of you who've stayed with us. We've gone over time slightly because it's been so compelling. These are going to continue to be explored in the rest of the public lectures in this series. Please do join us in a fortnight with Richard Horton. I think it will be really compelling. If you've enjoyed tonight, please do tell everybody about it and invite people to come back and to join us for future events. Look out for the video or audio of this event, which will be made available as soon as possible. It won't be immediately. So keep an eye out for that and do share that. We're getting lots of lovely praise and comments and so on in the chat now. So yeah, do take up my invitation to spread the word. Amitav, I want to extend to you a big thanks for a brilliant conversation at greater length even than we'd planned and across the Atlantic. And I know that you've been having some little teething troubles, as we call them in England, with your health. So we super appreciate your staying the course here and participating in this conversation. And it only remains for me to say thank you once again to everyone for coming. Thank you most of all to Amitav Ghosh. Thanks to everyone who helped put on this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you
Great.
for having me. Thanks,
oh,
Rich.
well, thanks so much. We will keep the meeting open for a few minutes in case there's more that people want to say in the chat, and also in case anyone wants to save the chat, which you can do with a button. It depends on your machine which button it is, in case anyone wants to do that. So we'll keep open for a few minutes, but we'll see you next, hopefully in a fortnight's time. Thanks very much, everybody. Good night.
Good night.